You watch as incompetent colleagues manipulate their way to positions of authority, while your honest efforts go unrecognized and unrewarded. Every day you witness those who play dirty politics advance rapidly while you struggle with the moral weight of compromising your principles for success. I am Niccolò Machiavelli, the political philosopher who spent years observing the brutal realities of power in Renaissance Italy, studying princes and politicians who rose and fell based on their understanding of human nature's darker truths. What I discovered about the acquisition and maintenance of absolute power will transform how you navigate every relationship, negotiation, and opportunity in your life. The dark laws I developed weren't born from malice but from necessity, watching noble men fail because they refused to acknowledge the harsh realities that govern human behavior and political success. Whether you're climbing corporate ladders or building personal influence, the same principles that guided Renaissance princes to victory can give you the strategic advantage you need in today's competitive world. But first, like this video, subscribe for more timeless political wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready to understand the true nature of power. I was born into a world where power was everything, yet I began my life with nothing but intellect and ambition. Florence, in my time, was a cauldron of competing interests, merchant families, foreign armies, papal politics, and the ever-shifting alliances that could elevate a man to greatness or destroy him overnight. My father was a lawyer of modest means, and I grew up watching from the shadows as the truly powerful shaped the destiny of our city-state. The Medici family ruled Florence when I was young, and I observed their court with the fascination of a scholar studying a particularly complex organism. Lorenzo the Magnificent held power not through birthright alone, but through an intricate web of patronage, fear, and carefully calculated generosity. I watched him reward loyalty and punish betrayal with equal precision, and I began to understand that successful rulers were not necessarily good men, but effective ones. When I entered government service as a young man, I believed in the Republic, in virtue, in the power of good intentions backed by noble actions. I served faithfully as a diplomat and administrator, genuinely believing that if we could just govern wisely and justly, Florence would prosper. I was, in those early years, exactly the kind of idealistic fool that I would later warn against in my writings. The first crack in my worldview came during my diplomatic missions. I was sent to negotiate with other Italian city-states, with the French court, with the Holy Roman Emperor himself. In these palaces and war camps, I witnessed the true mechanics of power. I saw how treaties were made and broken based on immediate advantage rather than long-term wisdom. I observed leaders who smiled warmly while plotting their negotiating partner's destruction. I learned that in the realm of high politics, your word was only as good as your ability to enforce it. But it was my encounters with Cesare Borgia that truly opened my eyes to the darker necessities of power. Here was a man who understood that in a world of wolves, acting like a sheep was a form of suicide. Borgia was ruthless, calculating, and utterly without sentiment when it came to political necessity. Yet he was also effective in ways that more traditionally virtuous leaders were not. He could bring order to chaos, unity to fractured territories, and peace through the strategic application of fear. I spent months observing Borgia's methods, initially with horror, then with reluctant admiration, and finally with the detached fascination of a natural philosopher studying the laws of political motion. I began to see that there were indeed laws governing the acquisition and maintenance of power, laws as reliable as those governing the movement of celestial bodies. These laws were not pleasant, but they were real. The final destruction of my idealistic worldview came with the collapse of the Florentine Republic I had served so faithfully. Despite our good intentions, our commitment to justice, and our genuine desire to serve the common good, we fell to the very forces I had been studying. The Medici returned to power, and I found myself imprisoned, tortured, and exiled from the city I had dedicated my life to serving. It was in that moment of personal and political ruin that I truly understood the harsh lesson that would shape everything I would later write. Good intentions, noble character, and virtuous behavior are not enough to survive in a world governed by power. Those who understand the true nature of power will always defeat those who cling to comfortable illusions about how the world should work, rather than accepting how it actually does work. My true education in the nature of power began not in the universities of Florence, but in the war camps and palaces where I served as a diplomatic observer. I was sent to witness history in the making, to negotiate treaties and assess military situations, but what I received was something far more valuable and terrible, a complete understanding of how power actually operates when stripped of all pretense and moral decoration. The most profound lesson came from my time observing Cesare Borgia during his conquest of the Romagna. I arrived expecting to find a monster, but what I discovered was far more disturbing, a man who had simply accepted the logical consequences of living in a world where power was the ultimate currency. Borgia understood that in politics, as in warfare, the victor writes the history and the loser provides the cautionary tale. I watched Borgia solve the problem of unifying rebellious territories through what I came to understand as calculated ruthlessness. When his subordinate Ramiro de Orco had served his purpose in pacifying the region through harsh measures, Borgia had him executed publicly and his body displayed in the town square. The people who had hated de Orco for his cruelty now saw Borgia as their protector. With one stroke, Borgia had eliminated a potential rival, satisfied the people's desire for justice, and demonstrated that his authority was absolute. It was brutal, but it was also brilliant. This is when I began to understand the first dark truth about power. It is not about being good or evil, but about being effective. The moral framework that guides private life becomes a luxury that those who wield power cannot afford. The leader who refuses to act decisively when the situation demands it will be replaced by someone who will. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does power. I saw this principle confirmed repeatedly during my diplomatic career. The French King Louis XII lost his Italian territories, not because he was wicked, but because he was inconsistent. He made alliances he couldn't maintain, threats he wouldn't carry out, and promises he couldn't keep. His moral scruples and desire to be seen as honorable ultimately made him powerless in a world where his opponents had no such constraints. The most chilling example came during my observation of the Pazzi conspiracy against the Medici. I watched as men who had been friends, allies, and even family members of the Medici plotted their destruction. The conspiracy failed not because of loyalty or moral outrage, but because it was poorly planned and executed. Lorenzo de' Medici survived not through the protection of divine providence, but through superior intelligence networks and more ruthless elimination of potential threats. This taught me that in the realm of power, trust is not a virtue but a vulnerability. Those closest to you have the most to gain from your downfall and the best opportunity to achieve it. The successful ruler must learn to distinguish between public loyalty and private ambition, between genuine devotion and calculated performance. I began to see that every great leader I observed had learned to compartmentalize their conscience. They could be loving fathers and ruthless politicians, generous patrons and calculating executioners, inspiring orators and manipulative strategists. The ability to switch between these modes without internal conflict was not a character flaw but a necessary skill. The most difficult lesson was learning to see human nature as it actually is rather than as we wish it to be. I observed that people respond more reliably to fear than to love, more predictably to immediate self-interest than to abstract principles, and more consistently to demonstrated power than to moral authority. These observations were not cynical philosophy, but empirical facts gathered through careful study of human behavior under the pressure of political reality. When I was finally exiled from Florence and had time to reflect on everything I had witnessed, I realized that I had been given a rare education in the true mechanics of power. Most people live their entire lives within systems of power without ever understanding how those systems actually function. They see only the public performances, the ceremonial displays, the official explanations. I had been privileged to witness the machinery itself. The first and perhaps most crucial dark law I discovered is this: never allow yourself to appear more capable, more intelligent, or more successful than those who hold power over you. I learnt this lesson by watching brilliant men destroy themselves through their own excellence and mediocre men rise to great heights by making their superiors feel secure in their superiority. During my time at the Medici court, I observed a young scholar named Giovanni della Casa who possessed extraordinary intelligence and eloquence. He could solve problems that baffled older advisors, could speak more persuasively than seasoned diplomats, and could write with a clarity and insight that made other court intellectuals seem pedestrian by comparison. Giovanni believed, as I once did, that excellence would be recognized and rewarded. Instead, I watched as Lorenzo de' Medici grew increasingly uncomfortable with Giovanni's obvious superiority. The young man's solutions were too elegant, his insights too penetrating, his presence too commanding. Other courtiers began to defer to Giovanni rather than to Lorenzo on matters of scholarship and strategy. Without realizing it, Giovanni was committing the cardinal sin of making his master appear inadequate. The end came swiftly. Lorenzo began excluding Giovanni from important meetings, questioned his judgments publicly, and eventually manufactured a minor scandal that provided the excuse to banish him from court. Giovanni's crime was not incompetence or disloyalty, but the opposite. He was too competent, too brilliant, too obviously superior to those around him, including the man who held his fate in his hands. I contrast this with the career of another courtier, Francesco Vettori, who possessed perhaps half of Giovanni's natural ability but understood intuitively how to manage his relationship with power. Francesco would present ideas in ways that allowed Lorenzo to improve upon them. He would ask questions that led Lorenzo to insights rather than simply providing the insights himself. He would defer to Lorenzo's judgment even when he privately disagreed, finding subtle ways to guide decisions without appearing to challenge authority. Francesco rose steadily through the ranks, eventually becoming one of Lorenzo's most trusted advisors, while Giovanni ended his days in obscurity. The lesson was clear. In the presence of power, your goal is not to demonstrate your superiority but to make power feel secure and enhanced by your service. This principle extends far beyond the obvious relationship between ruler and subject. I observed it operating at every level of the hierarchy. Successful subordinates learned to make their immediate superiors look good to their superiors. They understood that their advancement depended not on their objective merit, but on their ability to enhance the reputation and security of those who controlled their destiny. The mechanism behind this law is rooted in the fundamental psychology of power. Those who hold authority are constantly threatened by the possibility of being replaced by someone more capable. They maintain their position not through demonstrated superiority, but through the complex web of relationships, knowledge, and loyalty that surrounds them. When someone appears who might disrupt this web through obvious superiority, the natural response is elimination. I learned to apply this principle in my own career, though admittedly I learned it too late to save my position in the Republic. When I wrote to those in power, I was careful to present my insights as extensions of their own wisdom, rather than as corrections of their errors. When I offered advice, I framed it as humble suggestions rather than expert recommendations. When I achieved successes in my diplomatic missions, I was careful to share credit generously with my superiors. The modern application of this law is perhaps even more crucial today than it was in Renaissance Italy. In corporate environments, in academic institutions, in political organizations, the same dynamics operate. The subordinate who consistently outshines their superior in meetings, who receives more recognition for their contributions, or who attracts more attention from higher authorities, is creating the conditions for their own destruction. You must find ways to be genuinely valuable and impressive while ensuring that your value enhances rather than threatens those above you. This requires a sophisticated understanding of human psychology and a willingness to subordinate your ego to your strategic interests. It means accepting that recognition and advancement come not from being the smartest person in the room, but from making the most powerful person in the room feel like the smartest person in the room. The second dark law emerged from one of the most painful lessons of my political education. Those closest to you are often best positioned to destroy you. I learned this not through abstract philosophy, but by witnessing the intimate betrayals that toppled some of the most powerful figures of my era, and by experiencing the sting of abandoned loyalty in my own career. The most instructive example came from my study of Julius Caesar's assassination. Here was a man who had conquered Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, and become the most powerful figure in Rome. Yet he was not brought down by his enemies on the battlefield or by foreign conspirators. He was destroyed by his friends, his allies, his adopted son Brutus. The daggers that ended Caesar's life were wielded by men he had trusted, promoted, and in some cases loved like family. Caesar's fatal error was assuming that his generosity and friendship would create lasting loyalty. He believed that because he had elevated these men, because he had shared power with them, because he had treated them as equals and confidants, they would remain grateful and faithful. Instead, his very success became the source of their resentment. Each honor he bestowed upon them reminded them of their dependence upon him. Each display of his power highlighted their subordinate position. I saw this same dynamic play out repeatedly in the Italian courts. Friends become rivals because they know your weaknesses intimately. They understand your methods, your plans, your fears. They have access to your private thoughts and your unguarded moments. Most dangerously, they feel entitled to judge your actions and to expect consideration for their own ambitions. During my diplomatic service, I formed what I believed to be a genuine friendship with Piero Soderini, the head of the Florentine Republic. We shared philosophical discussions, strategic planning sessions, and what I thought was mutual respect and trust. When the political winds shifted and the Medici began their return to power, I expected Soderini to stand by me as I had stood by him. Instead, he distanced himself immediately, allowing me to become the scapegoat for the Republic's failures while he negotiated his own accommodation with the new regime. The betrayal was not born of malice, but of the simple calculation that preserving himself required sacrificing me. Our friendship, which I had valued highly, proved to be worth less than his political survival. I realized then that friendship in the context of power is always conditional, always subject to the shifting calculations of advantage and necessity. This is why I learned to value former enemies over close friends when it came to positions of trust and responsibility. A former enemy who comes to serve you has made a clear calculation that their interests are now aligned with yours. They have burned bridges with your opponents and have nowhere else to turn. Their loyalty, while perhaps not emotional, is at least rational and predictable. Friends, by contrast, always retain the option of betrayal.
They can convince themselves that their betrayal is justified by your failures, your ingratitude, or your insufficient attention to their needs. They can rationalize their actions as necessary corrections to your course, rather than as fundamental disloyalty. They can even frame their betrayal as a form of friendship, claiming they are saving you from yourself. The psychology behind this law is complex but predictable. Friendship creates expectations that power relationships inevitably violate. Friends expect equality, consideration, and emotional reciprocity.
I learned to develop comfort with silence, to view unexplained statements as complete communications, and to resist the urge to elaborate when my initial response was sufficient. When asked about my analysis of military threats facing Florence, I learned to say, several factors require monitoring, rather than providing detailed assessments that might influence policy prematurely or inappropriately. This principle applies with particular force to potentially controversial or sensitive topics. The more charged the subject, the more carefully words must be rationed. When discussing your opponents, your plans, your resources, or your concerns, every additional word increases the risk of misinterpretation, quotation out of context, or strategic intelligence gathering by interested parties. The art lies in saying just enough to satisfy immediate conversational requirements, while revealing as little as possible about your true thoughts, plans, or positions. This requires developing sensitivity to the difference between what people want to know and what they need to know, between satisfying curiosity and serving your interests. In modern contexts, this law becomes even more crucial because conversations can be recorded, statements can be transmitted instantly across networks, and casual remarks can become permanent parts of your public record. The discipline of strategic brevity, which once served Renaissance politicians well in private settings, now serves anyone who must navigate complex social and professional environments where words have consequences far beyond their immediate context. The fifth dark law revealed itself to me through observing how perception shapes reality in ways that actual ability never can. I learned that reputation is not merely the shadow of achievement, but often the substance of power itself. A carefully constructed reputation can accomplish what armies and treasuries cannot, while a damaged reputation can destroy what generations built. My education in this principle began with studying the career of Cesare Borgia, who understood that his reputation for ruthlessness was more valuable than actual ruthlessness itself. Borgia needed to pacify rebellious territories in the Romagna, but he lacked the military resources for extended campaigns against every dissenting city. Instead, he cultivated a reputation for swift, terrible retribution that preceded him like an invisible army. When Borgia approached a city, its leaders had already heard stories of what happened to those who resisted him. They had heard about Ramiro de Orco's fate, about the cunning trap that eliminated potential rivals at Senigallia, about the calculated displays of power that left no doubt about the consequences of opposition. Before Borgia's physical forces arrived, his reputation had already conquered the psychological terrain. Cities surrendered not to his army but to his legend. This taught me that reputation operates as a force multiplier, making your actual capabilities appear larger and more threatening than they might otherwise seem. But reputation can work in reverse as well, undermining real strength through the perception of weakness or incompetence. I witnessed this destructive power during the final days of the Florentine Republic. Despite having capable military forces, experienced administrators, and genuine popular support, the Republic suffered from a reputation for indecision and ineffectiveness. Foreign powers viewed us as unreliable allies, potential enemies saw us as easy targets, and our own citizens began to lose confidence in our ability to govern effectively. This reputation became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because we were perceived as weak, we faced more challenges than stronger governments might have encountered. Because we were seen as indecisive, our allies hedged their commitments to us. Because we appeared ineffective, our citizens became less willing to make sacrifices for the common good. Our actual capabilities became irrelevant in the face of widespread perception of our limitations. The mechanism behind reputation's power lies in the fundamental human tendency to act on incomplete information. Most people will never have direct experience of your capabilities, your character, or your intentions. They will form their opinions based on stories they hear, rumors they encounter, and impressions formed through brief interactions. These second-hand assessments will guide their behavior toward you far more than any objective evaluation of your actual qualities. This means that managing your reputation is not vanity, but necessity. You must understand how stories about you are created, transmitted, and interpreted. You must learn to influence these narratives without appearing to manipulate them. You must cultivate the specific impressions that will serve your strategic objectives. During my diplomatic career, I learned to approach reputation management as systematically as I approached any other aspect of statecraft. I considered what qualities would make me most effective in my role: reliability, insight, discretion, and access to important information. I then looked for opportunities to demonstrate these qualities in ways that would be noticed and remembered by key audiences. When I successfully predicted the outcome of a military campaign, I ensured that my analysis reached the right people in a form they would remember and associate with my judgment. When I handled sensitive negotiations discreetly, I made certain that my discretion was noted and appreciated by those who valued confidentiality. When I provided valuable intelligence, I delivered it in ways that highlighted both its accuracy and its exclusive nature. The key insight is that reputation must be actively constructed rather than passively earned. Excellence alone does not create reputation. Excellence combined with strategic communication creates reputation. You must not only perform effectively but ensure that your effectiveness is perceived, understood, and remembered by those whose opinions matter. This requires understanding your audience's values and priorities. A reputation for compassion might serve you well in one context while undermining your effectiveness in another. A reputation for ruthlessness might intimidate opponents while alienating potential allies. You must carefully consider which aspects of your character and capabilities to emphasize and which to downplay or conceal. I also learned that reputation, once established, becomes remarkably resistant to contradictory evidence. People tend to interpret new information in ways that confirm their existing beliefs about you. This means that early impressions carry disproportionate weight, and first encounters often determine the trajectory of entire relationships. But this resistance works both ways. A positive reputation can survive individual failures or setbacks, while a negative reputation can persist despite genuine improvements in performance or character. This is why reputation must be protected as carefully as it is constructed, and why damaging attacks on your reputation must be addressed swiftly and effectively. In our current age, where information travels instantly and first impressions are often formed through digital interactions, reputation management becomes even more crucial and more complex. The principles I observed in Renaissance Italy, that perception shapes reality, that stories matter more than facts, that reputation can be strategically influenced, apply with even greater force in environments where a single misstep can be broadcast to unlimited audiences and preserved indefinitely. The sixth dark law became clear to me through watching brilliant people fade into obscurity while mediocre individuals shaped the course of history, simply because they understood the supreme importance of visibility. I learned that in the realm of power, to be ignored is to be powerless, regardless of your actual capabilities or achievements. My most instructive observation came during the papal court of Alexander VI, where I witnessed the rise of a relatively minor cardinal named Alessandro Farnese. Farnese possessed neither exceptional intelligence nor remarkable piety, qualities that supposedly mattered in ecclesiastical advancement. What he possessed instead was an instinctive understanding that attention is the currency of influence. While other cardinals focused on theological scholarship or administrative competence, Farnese focused on being noticed. He commissioned elaborate artworks that featured his personal symbols prominently. He hosted spectacular entertainments that became the talk of Rome. He involved himself in dramatic controversies that kept his name circulating in gossip and official dispatches alike. Most importantly, he understood that negative attention was often more valuable than no attention at all. I watched Farnese deliberately position himself at the center of a scandal involving the Pope's daughter Lucrezia Borgia. Rather than avoiding association with the controversial papal family, he embraced it, allowing rumors about his relationship with Lucrezia to flourish, while maintaining just enough ambiguity to avoid definitive condemnation. The scandal made him one of the most talked-about figures in Rome, and notoriety translated directly into influence. Meanwhile, Cardinal Giovanni Battista Ferrari, a man of genuine scholarly achievement and unquestionable moral character, remained virtually invisible despite his superior qualifications. Ferrari produced thoughtful theological treatises that were read by perhaps a dozen scholars, administered his diocese efficiently but quietly, and conducted himself with a dignity that attracted no attention whatsoever. His excellence was irrelevant because it was unnoticed. This taught me that attention operates as a prerequisite for all other forms of power. You cannot influence people who do not think about you. You cannot inspire followers who do not know you exist. You cannot shape events if you remain peripheral to the conversations that determine policy. Attention is not a byproduct of achievement, but a foundation for it. The psychology behind this law involves the fundamental limitation of human cognitive resources. People can only focus on a limited number of individuals at any given time. In any organization, community, or society, there are always more people deserving attention than there is attention available. Those who receive attention gain access to opportunities, resources, and influence that are simply unavailable to those who remain unnoticed. I began to study the techniques used by successful attention gatherers and discovered that they fell into several categories. Some cultivated mystery and intrigue, making themselves interesting through selective disclosure and calculated ambiguity. Others created drama and controversy, positioning themselves at the center of conflicts that others found compelling. Still others developed unique styles or approaches that made them memorable and distinctive. During my own career, I learned to apply these principles within the constraints of diplomatic propriety. When I returned from missions abroad, I would craft my reports to include not just dry factual information, but compelling narratives that would be remembered and retold. I would identify unique insights or predict unexpected developments that would distinguish my analysis from routine intelligence gathering. I also learned to time my communications strategically, ensuring that important information reached key decision-makers when they were most receptive and when my insights would receive maximum attention. I would position myself to be present during crucial conversations, not merely as an observer but as a participant, whose presence would be noted and whose contributions would be remembered. The art of courting attention requires understanding the difference between useful visibility and counterproductive notoriety. You want to be noticed for qualities and activities that enhance your reputation and advance your objectives. You want to avoid attention that damages your standing or associates you with failure and controversy. This balance requires sophisticated judgment about timing, audience, and context. The same action that generates positive attention in one situation might create destructive notoriety in another. The key is to understand what your specific audience values, fears, and finds compelling, then position yourself to embody those qualities in memorable ways. I observed that the most successful practitioners of this law understood how to make their attention-seeking appear natural and justified rather than desperate or manipulative. They would create legitimate reasons for visibility, organizing important events, leading significant initiatives, or taking positions on crucial issues that serve genuine purposes while also ensuring their prominence. The modern application of this principle has become both easier and more complex. Digital platforms provide unprecedented opportunities for visibility, but they also create intense competition for limited attention spans. The fundamental challenge remains the same: how to distinguish yourself in ways that serve your strategic objectives while avoiding the appearance of self-promotion or attention-seeking. The solution lies in understanding that attention is not an end in itself, but a means to influence and opportunity. You court attention not for the satisfaction of being noticed, but for the power that visibility provides. When you frame attention-seeking in terms of service to larger purposes, sharing valuable insights, promoting important causes, or facilitating necessary conversations, you can pursue visibility without compromising your integrity or reputation. The key insight is that in any competitive environment, excellence without visibility is effectively worthless, while moderate capability combined with strategic attention gathering can achieve remarkable results. This is not a cynical observation but a practical reality that those who seek to exercise influence must acknowledge and master. The seventh dark law emerged from observing how successful leaders position themselves as the indispensable center of achievement, while others provide the actual labor and expertise. I learned that the ability to coordinate, direct, and claim ownership of collective efforts is often more valuable than any individual contribution to those efforts. My education in this principle came through watching Pope Julius II during his ambitious project to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica. Julius possessed no architectural expertise, no engineering knowledge, and no artistic skills relevant to the massive undertaking, yet he became known throughout Europe as the visionary behind one of the greatest architectural achievements in Christian history. Julius accomplished this by mastering the art of strategic positioning. He hired Bramante as his architect, Michelangelo as his sculptor, and Raphael as his painter, but he presented their work as the execution of his grand vision. When visitors marveled at the basilica's design, Julius would explain how he had conceived the overall concept and selected the artists to realize his dream. When problems arose during construction, Julius would appear to solve them through decisive leadership, even though the actual solutions came from his hired experts. The key to Julius's success was his understanding that coordination and vision could be presented as more valuable than technical execution. He positioned himself not as a worker among workers, but as the irreplaceable mind that conceived the project and guided its completion. Without Julius, there would have been no basilica. Without any individual artist or craftsman, the project would have continued with replacements. I observed this same pattern in military campaigns, where successful generals claimed credit for victories achieved through the blood and skill of their soldiers.
The general who positioned himself as the strategic genius behind battlefield success could build a reputation that transcended any individual engagement, while the soldiers who actually fought and died remained anonymous contributors to his legend. During my diplomatic career, I learned to apply this principle in my own work. When I was assigned to assess the military capabilities of potential enemies, I would gather information from numerous sources: spies, merchants, travelers, and local informants. I would synthesize their reports, analyze their implications, and present comprehensive assessments to my superiors. The intelligence I provided was valuable not because I had personally observed enemy fortifications or counted their soldiers, but because I had organized scattered information into coherent strategic insights. I positioned myself as the indispensable analyzer and interpreter, even though the raw information came from others. My superiors valued my reports because they represented coordinated intelligence rather than fragmentary observations. The psychology behind this law involves the human tendency to credit the visible coordinator rather than the invisible contributors. When people see a successful outcome, they naturally look for a single individual to associate with that success. The person who appears to be in charge, who speaks authoritatively about the project, and who is present during key moments of achievement, will receive credit regardless of their actual contribution to the work. This dynamic creates opportunities for those who understand how to position themselves strategically. You do not need to be the most skilled individual contributor to become the recognized leader of successful initiatives. You need to be the person who appears indispensable to coordination, who takes responsibility for overall outcomes, and who ensures that your role is visible and understood. The art lies in making your coordinating function genuinely valuable rather than merely parasitic. You must provide real organizational benefits, bringing together the right people, facilitating their collaboration, removing obstacles to their work, and ensuring that their efforts are directed toward coherent objectives. When your coordination actually improves outcomes, your claim to credit becomes legitimate rather than manipulative. I learned to identify projects where coordination was genuinely needed, and to position myself as the natural person to provide it. I would volunteer to organize complex initiatives, offer to synthesize different perspectives into unified recommendations, and take responsibility for ensuring that collaborative efforts produced concrete results. The key insight is that most people prefer to focus on their individual expertise rather than on the more difficult work of coordination and integration. This creates opportunities for those willing to take on the complex tasks of managing relationships, resolving conflicts, and ensuring that collective efforts remain focused on shared objectives. However, this law requires careful application to avoid creating resentment among those whose work you coordinate. You must find ways to acknowledge individual contributions while still positioning yourself as the essential orchestrator. You must share enough credit to maintain cooperation while retaining enough to build your own reputation. I discovered that the most effective approach was to praise specific individuals for their unique contributions while reserving for myself the broader credit for the project's conception, coordination, and successful completion. This allowed collaborators to feel recognized for their specialized skills while establishing my role as the indispensable leader who made their success possible. In modern contexts, this principle applies particularly well to complex projects that require diverse expertise and sustained coordination. The individual who can successfully position themselves as the integrator, the communicator, and the strategic overseer will often receive more recognition and advancement than contributors with superior technical skills but limited visibility. The challenge is to develop genuine coordination capabilities rather than simply claiming credit for others' work. This requires learning to identify what different contributors need to be successful, how to facilitate their collaboration, and how to ensure that collective efforts produce results that exceed what individuals could achieve independently. When you provide real value as a coordinator, your claim to leadership credit becomes both legitimate and strategically advantageous.
The eighth dark law revealed itself to me through observing how power operates through positioning rather than pursuit. I learned that those who make others come to them control not only the terms of engagement but the psychological dynamics that determine outcomes. The supplicant is always at a disadvantage to the one who grants or withholds access. My most profound lesson in this principle came from studying the court of Pope Alexander VI, who had transformed the papal palace into a center of gravity that drew the most powerful figures in Europe to seek his favor. Alexander never traveled to negotiate with kings and emperors. Instead, he created circumstances that made them come to Rome to negotiate with him. Alexander understood that the act of seeking an audience creates psychological subordination regardless of the relative power of the parties involved. When the King of France sent ambassadors to the Vatican, the very act of supplication diminished French authority and enhanced papal prestige. When rulers made pilgrimages to kiss the papal ring, they were acknowledging Alexander's superior position through their physical deference. But Alexander's genius lay not in his formal authority as pope, but in his strategic use of scarcity and exclusivity. He made access to himself valuable by making it difficult to obtain. Audiences were granted sparingly and only after elaborate protocols had been observed. This artificial scarcity created genuine demand, as political figures competed for the privilege of presenting their cases directly to the pontiff. I observed this same dynamic operating in secular courts, where successful rulers learned to make themselves the fixed point around which others orbited. Lorenzo de' Medici in Florence, Francesco Sforza in Milan, and Ferrante in Naples all understood that their palaces should function as magnets drawing suitors, allies, and even enemies into their sphere of influence. The psychological mechanism behind this law operates through several interconnected principles. First, the person who comes to you has already acknowledged your importance and their need for what you can provide. This acknowledgement shapes the entire subsequent interaction, creating an implicit hierarchy that favors the person being sought out. Second, when others come to you, they enter your environment, where you control the physical and social context of the encounter. You determine the timing, the setting, the presence or absence of witnesses, and the ceremonial elements that frame the interaction. These environmental factors subtly but powerfully influence the psychological dynamics of negotiation and persuasion. Third, making others come to you allows you to control the tempo and frequency of interactions. You can create urgency by limiting availability, demonstrate importance by making others wait, and shape expectations by controlling when and how access is granted. During my diplomatic career, I learned to apply this principle within the constraints of my official role. While I could not make foreign dignitaries come to me in the manner of a sovereign, I could position myself as the essential conduit for certain types of information and access. I cultivated relationships with key figures in various courts and made myself indispensable for anyone seeking to understand or influence Florentine policy. When other diplomats wanted to assess Florence's likely response to military developments, they found it necessary to seek me out. When foreign merchants needed guidance on navigating Florentine commercial regulations, they discovered that I possessed crucial insights and connections. By making myself the most efficient path to important information and relationships, I ensured that others would come to me rather than forcing me to pursue them. The art of this law lies in creating genuine value that others need while making that value available only through direct engagement with you. This requires developing expertise, relationships, or resources that are both valuable and difficult to obtain elsewhere. You must become a destination rather than a seeker. I discovered that scarcity could be applied not just to access but to the timing and conditions of that access. By being selective about when I was available for consultation, by requiring advance notice for meetings, and by maintaining a schedule that appeared full of important activities, I created the impression that my time and attention were valuable commodities. This approach required discipline and patience. The natural tendency is to pursue opportunities aggressively, to make yourself readily available to anyone who might advance your interests, and to demonstrate eagerness for engagement. But these behaviors signal desperation rather than value, need rather than capability. The modern application of this principle has become more complex in an age of instant communication and global connectivity. However, the fundamental dynamics remain unchanged. Those who make themselves indispensable destinations, whether through expertise, relationships, resources, or unique capabilities, still enjoy the psychological and strategic advantages that come from being sought out rather than seeking. The key is to identify what you can provide that others genuinely need and cannot easily obtain elsewhere. This might be specialized knowledge, access to important networks, unique analytical capabilities, or the ability to facilitate valuable connections. Once you have established this value, you must learn to present it in ways that require others to engage with you on your terms. The ultimate insight is that power flows not to those who chase opportunities, but to those who create circumstances that make opportunities chase them. This requires building genuine capability and value, while positioning that value in ways that attract rather than pursue, that draw rather than push, that make others come to you rather than forcing you to go to them. The ninth dark law became apparent to me through witnessing countless brilliant arguments fail to achieve their objectives while decisive actions settled debates that words could never resolve. I learned that in the realm of power, demonstration carries infinitely more weight than explanation, and that those who rely on logic and rhetoric often lose to those who understand the superior persuasive force of accomplished facts. My education in this principle began during a territorial dispute between Florence and Pisa that had been grinding on for years through diplomatic channels. Both sides had presented elaborate legal arguments based on historical precedents, treaty interpretations, and claims of traditional authority. Florentine scholars had produced learned treatises proving our rightful jurisdiction over the disputed territory. Pisan advocates had responded with equally learned refutations and counterclaims. While this war of words continued, Cesare Borgia simply moved his forces into the territory and began governing it effectively. He established new administrative systems, collected taxes, dispensed justice, and provided security for the local population. Within months, the academic question of legal authority became irrelevant. Borgia controlled the territory not because he had won the argument, but because he had won the reality. The local population, initially skeptical of Borgia's authority, gradually accepted his rule because it provided them with tangible benefits that the endless legal disputes had never delivered. Trade resumed, banditry was suppressed, and disputes were resolved quickly through Borgia's courts. The people began to see Borgia as their legitimate ruler, not because of any theoretical claims, but because of the practical results his governance produced. This taught me that people are far more influenced by observable outcomes than by logical arguments. You can present the most compelling case for your position, but if your opponents can point to contrary evidence in the form of actual results, your arguments become irrelevant. Conversely, if you can demonstrate success through action, people will often accept your authority even if they cannot explain why you deserve it. I observed this dynamic repeatedly in military affairs, where commanders who talked extensively about strategy often lost to those who simply executed effective tactics. During the Italian wars, I watched French generals hold elaborate war councils to debate the theoretical advantages of various approaches, while their opponents were already implementing practical solutions that rendered the French discussions obsolete. The psychological mechanism behind this law operates through the fundamental human tendency to trust experience over theory. When people witness successful outcomes, they naturally attribute authority and credibility to those who produced them. When they see failure, they become skeptical of explanations and justifications regardless of how logical they might be. Arguments, no matter how brilliant, require the audience to evaluate abstract reasoning and choose between competing interpretations of incomplete information. This cognitive work is difficult, and people naturally resist it. Actions, by contrast, provide concrete evidence that anyone can evaluate directly. Success speaks a universal language that transcends education, culture, and personal bias. During my diplomatic career, I learned to apply this principle by focusing on producing small, visible successes rather than engaging in extended debates about policy approaches. When I believed that Florence needed to strengthen its military capabilities, I did not waste time arguing with skeptics about the theoretical benefits of military preparedness. Instead, I identified specific, achievable improvements that could be implemented quickly and would produce observable results. I arranged for improvements in fortress defenses that were visible to anyone passing through the city. I facilitated training exercises that demonstrated enhanced military effectiveness to both citizens and potential enemies. I negotiated arms purchases that could be displayed publicly as evidence of growing Florentine strength. These concrete achievements spoke more persuasively than any theoretical arguments about military necessity. The art of this law lies in selecting actions that will be both achievable and demonstrative. You must choose objectives that you can realistically accomplish with available resources, but that will also provide clear evidence of your capability and effectiveness. The goal is not just to succeed, but to succeed in ways that others will notice and remember. I discovered that timing is crucial for this approach. You must act when success is most likely and when the results will receive maximum attention. You must also be prepared to build on initial successes quickly, before opponents can organize effective responses or before public attention shifts to other matters. This principle requires developing comfort with risk and uncertainty. Arguments can be crafted carefully and refined endlessly before presentation. Actions must be taken based on incomplete information and cannot be recalled once their consequences become apparent. This demands both courage and judgment that many intelligent people find difficult to develop. The modern application of this law has become even more relevant in environments where information overload makes people skeptical of complex arguments and eager for simple demonstrations of effectiveness. In business, politics, and personal relationships, those who can point to concrete achievements enjoy enormous advantages over those who rely on theoretical justifications. The key insight is that credibility flows from demonstrated capability rather than articulated reasoning. People believe in your ability to solve problems when they see evidence that you have solved similar problems before. They trust your judgment when your previous judgments have produced good outcomes. They follow your leadership when your leadership has taken them places they wanted to go. This does not mean abandoning argument entirely, but rather understanding that argument serves primarily to explain and contextualize what you have already proven through action. The most persuasive combination is decisive action followed by clear explanation, not the reverse.
When you can demonstrate success and then help others understand how and why you achieved it, you create the most powerful possible foundation for future influence and authority. The 10th and perhaps most ruthless dark law emerged from observing how misfortune spreads through association and how the perception of failure becomes contagious among those who cannot distinguish between correlation and causation. I learned that in the realm of power you are judged not only by your own actions and outcomes, but by the fate of those with whom you choose to associate. My education in this principle came through watching the career trajectory of Piero Soderini, who had been my colleague and friend during the Florentine Republic. Soderini was a capable administrator and a genuinely well-intentioned leader, but he possessed a fatal flaw. He was irresistibly drawn to lost causes and failing enterprises. He seemed to believe that his support could rescue any troubled situation through the application of virtue and determination. When minor nobles fell from favor with other Italian courts, Soderini would offer them sanctuary in Florence. When failed merchants sought backing for new ventures, he would provide funding and encouragement. When discredited diplomats needed employment, he would find positions for them in our government. In each case, he believed he was demonstrating Christian charity and Florentine values. The result was predictable and devastating. Florence became known throughout Italy as the refuge for the unsuccessful, the unlucky, and the politically contaminated. Other courts began to view us with suspicion, wondering what hidden failures or scandals had driven these individuals to seek shelter with us. Potential allies questioned our judgment in associating with those whom others had rejected. Our reputation for competence and reliability suffered through our association with failure. The psychological mechanism behind this law operates through the fundamental human tendency to assume that association implies similarity. When people see you consistently surrounded by unsuccessful individuals, they naturally conclude that you share whatever qualities led to their failures. When your close associates suffer reversals and setbacks, observers assume that the same forces that destroyed them may soon destroy you. This dynamic operates independently of any logical connection between your circumstances and those of your associates. The perception of contagion creates actual consequences through the changed behavior of others toward you. If powerful figures believe that association with you brings bad luck, they will avoid you regardless of your actual capabilities or track record. I observed this principle operating with devastating effect during the final years of the Byzantine Empire. As Constantinople's power waned, the imperial court became a magnet for exiled rulers, dispossessed nobles, and failed military commanders from across the eastern Mediterranean. These refugees brought with them stories of lost territories, broken alliances, and military defeats. The Byzantine emperor, motivated by religious duty and political sympathy, welcomed these unfortunates and provided them with positions in his government and military. However, their presence reinforced the growing perception that Byzantium itself was becoming a refuge for the defeated. This reputation made it even more difficult for the empire to attract capable allies or inspire confidence among its own subjects. During my own career, I learned to apply this law with considerable internal conflict, as it required abandoning people who had shown me friendship and loyalty during better times. When the Florentine Republic fell and I was imprisoned and exiled, I understood that many of my former colleagues would need to distance themselves from me to preserve their own positions under the new Medici regime. Rather than resenting this abandonment, I came to understand it as a necessary application of political survival instincts. Those who continued to associate with me openly would have compromised their ability to serve Florence effectively under the new government. Their rejection of me was not personal betrayal but strategic wisdom. This understanding led me to develop a more sophisticated approach to relationships and associations. I learned to distinguish between private loyalty and public association, between personal affection and strategic positioning. I could maintain genuine care for individuals while recognizing that visible association with them might damage my ability to achieve larger objectives. The art of applying this law lies in developing sensitivity to the subtle ways that others' fortunes affect perception of your own position. You must learn to recognize when someone's luck is turning bad, and when continued association might damage your reputation. This requires constant attention to social and political currents that might not be immediately obvious. I discovered that the key is to create distance gradually and diplomatically, rather than through sudden, obvious rejection. Abrupt abandonment of associates creates its own reputational problems, suggesting that you are unreliable or opportunistic. Instead, you must find ways to reduce the visibility of problematic associations while maintaining enough connection to avoid appearing callous. This might involve reducing the frequency of public appearances together, declining to advocate for them in new ventures, or simply being less available for consultation and collaboration. The goal is to avoid having their misfortunes reflect on your judgment, while preserving enough relationship to maintain your reputation for loyalty and decency. The modern application of this principle has become more complex in an age where past associations can be documented and preserved indefinitely. Digital records make it impossible to completely erase evidence of previous relationships, but the fundamental dynamic remains unchanged. Those who consistently associate with unsuccessful, controversial, or unlucky individuals will find their own opportunities limited by others' assumptions about guilt by association. The key insight is that reputation is fragile and that others' misfortunes can damage your standing even when you bear no responsibility for their failures. This reality requires developing the discipline to prioritize your strategic position over your personal sympathies, while finding ways to maintain your integrity and values within these constraints. The goal is not to become heartless, but to understand how perception operates in competitive environments and to position yourself accordingly. The dark laws I discovered in Renaissance Italy have not lost their power in your modern world. They have simply adapted to new environments and technologies. The fundamental dynamics of human nature that governed power in my time continue to operate in your corporate boardrooms, political arenas, and social networks. What has changed is not the nature of power, but the speed and scale at which it operates. Consider how the first law, never outshine the master, applies in your contemporary workplace. The employee who consistently demonstrates superior knowledge or capability to their manager faces the same risks that courtiers faced in my era. The mechanisms of elimination have become more subtle: unfavorable performance reviews, exclusion from important projects, barriers to promotion, but the outcome remains the same. Excellence without political awareness still leads to professional destruction. I have observed modern leaders who understand this principle intuitively. They present their insights as natural extensions of their superior's vision. They ask strategic questions that guide their managers toward correct conclusions rather than simply providing answers. They ensure that their successes enhance their supervisor's reputation rather than overshadowing it. These individuals advance rapidly through hierarchies while their more obviously talented colleagues struggle to understand why their merit goes unrecognized. The second law, never trust friends completely, has become even more crucial in an age where professional and personal relationships intersect constantly. I see people sharing sensitive information with colleagues they consider friends, only to discover that friendship dissolves quickly when career interests conflict. The modern workplace creates numerous situations where personal loyalty and professional advancement cannot coexist, and those who fail to understand this distinction repeatedly find themselves betrayed by people they trusted.
The fourth law, say less than necessary, has become even more valuable in an age of recorded conversations and permanent digital records. Every statement can be preserved, analyzed, and potentially used against you in contexts you never anticipated. Those who understand this reality have learned to communicate with precision, revealing only what serves their immediate objectives while avoiding commitments that might limit future flexibility. The fifth law, reputation management, now operates at unprecedented speed and scale. A single misstep can be broadcast to millions within hours, while building positive reputation requires sustained effort over extended periods. Modern power seekers have learned to approach reputation as systematically as any other strategic asset, carefully crafting public personas that serve their objectives while protecting against reputational attacks. I observe how successful modern figures apply the sixth law, court attention, through sophisticated understanding of media cycles, social platforms, and public psychology. They have learned to create intrigue and fascination while appearing to avoid the spotlight. They understand that in an attention economy, visibility translates directly into opportunity, influence, and power. The seventh law, coordinate others' work while claiming appropriate credit, has found perfect expression in modern management and leadership roles. The most successful executives position themselves as visionaries and orchestrators while building teams of specialists who handle implementation. They have learned to balance individual recognition with team motivation, claiming enough credit to advance their careers while sharing enough to maintain cooperation. The eighth law, make others come to you, operates through the creation of indispensable expertise, relationships, or resources. Modern power holders have learned to position themselves as essential nodes in important networks, as gatekeepers to valuable opportunities, or as providers of unique capabilities that others need. They build their influence by becoming destinations rather than supplicants. The ninth law, demonstrate rather than argue, has become crucial in environments where people are overwhelmed with information and skeptical of theoretical claims. Those who understand this principle focus on producing visible results that speak louder than any presentation or proposal. They build credibility through documented achievements rather than articulated potential. The 10th law, avoid association with failure, requires sophisticated judgment in interconnected modern environments. Successful individuals have learned to distance themselves from failing projects, declining organizations, and unlucky associates without appearing disloyal or opportunistic. They understand that perception of success is almost as important as actual success. The application of these laws in your current environment requires adaptation to new technologies and social structures, but the underlying principles remain constant. Power still flows to those who understand human psychology, who can navigate complex social dynamics, and who can position themselves strategically within competitive hierarchies. The key difference is that modern applications must account for increased transparency, accelerated communication, and global connectivity. Mistakes are harder to hide, reputations can be damaged more quickly, and success requires managing perception across multiple audiences simultaneously. However, these changes create opportunities as well as challenges for those who understand how to apply timeless principles to contemporary circumstances. The most successful modern practitioners of these laws combine historical wisdom with current awareness, understanding both the eternal aspects of human nature and the specific dynamics of their immediate environment. They have learned to be patient where patience serves them, aggressive where aggression is required, and adaptive where circumstances demand flexibility. I must confess that understanding these dark laws of power has exacted a profound personal cost that I did not anticipate when I first began my studies of political reality. The knowledge of how power truly operates creates a burden that weighs heavily on the soul, for once you see the mechanisms that govern human behavior in competitive environments, you can never again view relationships and interactions with the innocence you once possessed. When I was young and served the Florentine Republic with idealistic fervor, I believed that good intentions and virtuous behavior would naturally lead to good outcomes. I thought that people would recognize merit, reward loyalty, and support those who served the common good. This naivety allowed me to sleep peacefully at night, secure in my faith that justice would ultimately prevail and that moral behavior was not only right but strategically sound. The destruction of that worldview came gradually, through the accumulation of observations that contradicted everything I wanted to believe about human nature and political reality. Each betrayal I witnessed, each virtuous person destroyed by less scrupulous opponents, each successful manipulation of noble impulses added weight to a growing understanding that troubled my conscience profoundly. The most difficult realization was that the world punishes those who refuse to acknowledge its true nature. The leader who insists on complete honesty in negotiations will be systematically deceived by opponents who understand the strategic value of selective truth. The person who trusts absolutely will be betrayed by those who trust strategically. The individual who refuses to compete for attention will be ignored while less capable but more visible rivals advance. This creates a moral dilemma that has haunted me throughout my career. To what extent can one preserve personal integrity while operating effectively in systems that reward behavior that contradicts traditional virtues? The answer, I discovered, is neither simple nor comfortable. I learned that survival in competitive environments often requires actions that would be considered morally questionable in private life. The diplomat who reveals all his nation's constraints to enemy negotiators may be acting honestly, but he is also betraying his responsibility to his people. The leader who refuses to make difficult personnel decisions to spare feelings may be acting compassionately, but he is also failing to serve the larger organization effectively. These situations forced me to develop a more nuanced understanding of morality that distinguishes between personal ethics and public responsibility. What I concluded was that those who seek to exercise power on behalf of others, whether in government, business, or any competitive environment, must sometimes compromise their personal moral preferences to serve their larger obligations. This does not mean abandoning all ethical constraints or embracing unlimited ruthlessness. Rather, it means developing sophisticated judgment about when traditional virtues serve your larger purposes and when they become obstacles to achieving important objectives. The key is maintaining a clear hierarchy of values that allows you to make difficult decisions while preserving your core identity and principles. I found that the most sustainable approach involved creating clear boundaries between different spheres of life and different types of relationships. In my private life, with family and genuine friends, I could maintain the honesty, loyalty, and generosity that I valued personally. In my professional life, where I bore responsibility for Florence's interests, I had to apply different standards that prioritized effectiveness over personal comfort. This compartmentalization is psychologically demanding and requires constant self-reflection to prevent the cynicism necessary for public effectiveness from contaminating the trust and openness essential for private happiness. I discovered that those who successfully navigate this challenge develop the ability to shift between different modes of thinking and behavior depending on the context and the stakes involved. The price of this approach includes a certain loneliness that comes from understanding dynamics that others prefer to ignore. Once you recognize how manipulation operates, you begin to see it everywhere, including in relationships and situations where you would prefer to maintain innocent trust. Once you understand how reputation management works, you cannot help but notice when others are managing their image, which changes how you interpret their apparently spontaneous behavior. Perhaps most challenging is the knowledge that others may be applying these same laws in their interactions with you. This creates a recursive complexity where you must constantly evaluate whether apparent friendship is genuine affection or strategic positioning, whether offers of assistance reflect generosity or calculated investment, whether information shared with you is honest communication or tactical misdirection. The danger in all of this is developing such cynicism that you lose the ability to form genuine relationships or to recognize authentic virtue when you encounter it. The antidote, I discovered, is maintaining clear distinctions between competitive environments where these laws apply and collaborative environments where different principles should govern behavior. The ultimate insight is that power and virtue are not inherently incompatible, but they require careful balance and sophisticated judgment. The person who understands these dark laws but chooses to apply them selectively in service of larger purposes and within appropriate boundaries can maintain both effectiveness and integrity. The key is never losing sight of why you sought power in the first place and ensuring that your methods remain proportionate to your objectives. The mastery of strategic deception represents perhaps the most sophisticated and morally complex aspect of political power, requiring a careful distinction between outright falsehood and the selective presentation of truth. Through my years of observation and practice, I learned that effective leaders rarely lie directly, but they become masters of creating beneficial misconceptions while maintaining technical honesty. My education in this art began with studying Pope Alexander VI, who possessed an almost supernatural ability to communicate different messages to different audiences without ever making statements that could be proven false. When Alexander met with French ambassadors, he would speak enthusiastically about the friendship between the Papal States and France, emphasizing shared interests and mutual respect. When he met with Spanish representatives later the same day, he would express similar enthusiasm about Papal-Spanish relations, highlighting different but equally genuine aspects of those relationships. Neither statement was false, but together they created impressions that could not both be true. The French left believing they had special papal support for their Italian ambitions. The Spanish departed convinced of papal backing for their own conflicting objectives. Alexander had not lied to either party, but he had allowed each to deceive themselves about the exclusivity of papal favor. This taught me that the most effective deception often involves providing truthful information while carefully controlling the context and interpretation that audiences apply to that information. You can be absolutely honest about facts while being strategically misleading about implications, emphasis, and relative importance. During my diplomatic career, I learned to apply this principle when reporting on my missions to foreign courts. When I returned from France with intelligence about their military preparations, I could honestly report that the French were strengthening their forces while choosing to emphasize either the defensive or offensive implications of those preparations depending on what policy response I believed Florence should adopt. If I thought Florence should prepare for French aggression, I would frame the military intelligence in terms of growing threats and expansionist ambitions. If I believed Florence should seek closer ties with France, I would present the same information as evidence of French strength that could benefit Florentine interests through alliance. In both cases, my factual reporting was accurate, but my interpretive framework guided policy discussions toward conclusions I considered strategically sound. The psychological mechanism that makes this approach effective lies in the human tendency to focus more on implications than on raw information. People hear facts, but they act on the meanings they assign to those facts. By controlling the interpretive context, the comparisons, the emphasis, the suggested significance, you can guide others toward conclusions they believe they have reached independently. This technique requires developing comfort with ambiguity and learning to communicate in ways that satisfy multiple interpretations simultaneously. You must master the art of saying things that can be understood differently by different audiences while remaining technically accurate in all versions. I discovered that the most powerful tool for strategic deception is selective silence. What you choose not to mention often shapes interpretation more than what you explicitly state. When describing a potential ally's capabilities, you might honestly praise their strengths while simply omitting mention of crucial weaknesses. When assessing a rival's threats, you might accurately report their hostile intentions while failing to emphasize their limited capacity to act on those intentions. The art lies in making these omissions appear natural rather than calculated. You must develop sensitivity to what questions others are likely to ask, and prepare responses that provide satisfying information without revealing everything you know. You must learn to redirect attention toward aspects of situations that support your objectives, while allowing less favorable aspects to fade into the background through benign neglect. Another crucial technique involves the strategic use of uncertainty and speculation. Rather than making definitive statements that can be proven wrong, you can express qualified assessments that protect you from accusations of falsehood while still influencing others' thinking. Phrases like "it appears that," or "evidence suggests," or "one might conclude," allow you to shape interpretation while maintaining plausible deniability if circumstances change. I learned to master the timing of revelations as well as their content.
Information disclosed early in a conversation creates different impressions than the same information revealed later. Facts presented before decision-makers have formed preliminary judgments carry different weight than facts presented afterward. By controlling when different pieces of information become available, you can guide the thought processes of others without manipulating the information itself. The most sophisticated application of this principle involves creating situations where others deceive themselves while you maintain complete honesty. This requires understanding people's psychological biases, their hopes and fears, and their tendency to interpret ambiguous information in ways that confirm their existing beliefs or serve their immediate interests. The ethical challenge in all of this is maintaining a clear distinction between strategic communication and manipulative fraud. The boundary lies in whether your deception serves legitimate purposes proportionate to the stakes involved, whether you are protecting important interests or simply advancing personal advantage at others' expense. I concluded that strategic deception becomes morally justified when it serves broader purposes than personal advancement, when it protects valuable relationships or institutions, and when direct honesty would produce outcomes that serve no one's genuine interests. The key is ensuring that your deceptive practices remain tools in service of larger values rather than becoming ends in themselves. The ultimate application of these dark laws lies in constructing what I call a personal principality, a sphere of influence and control that operates according to your vision and serves your strategic objectives. Unlike the territorial principalities I studied in Renaissance Italy, your modern principality will be built from relationships, expertise, reputation, and strategic positioning rather than from armies and fortifications. My understanding of principality building began with observing Cesare Borgia's systematic approach to consolidating power in the Romagna. Borgia did not simply conquer territories, he transformed them into integrated components of a larger system that served his strategic vision. He eliminated competing power centers, established loyal administrative structures, and created economic and social incentives that aligned local interests with his own objectives. The same principles that guided Borgia's territorial consolidation can guide your construction of influence and authority in contemporary environments. You must identify the resources and relationships necessary for achieving your objectives, systematically acquire control over those assets, and organize them into a coherent system that amplifies your power while serving the interests of those who support you. The foundation of any principality is loyal followers who benefit from your success and whose own advancement depends on supporting your vision. These relationships cannot be based solely on personal affection or abstract loyalty. They must be grounded in mutual advantage and shared objectives. Your followers must prosper when you prosper, and suffer when you suffer. During my diplomatic career, I learned to build such relationships by identifying individuals whose talents complemented my own and whose career advancement I could influence positively. I would provide them with opportunities to demonstrate their capabilities, share credit for successes in ways that enhanced their reputations, and ensure that their association with me opened doors that would otherwise remain closed. In return, these individuals became sources of information, advocates for my initiatives, and extensions of my influence in contexts where I could not operate directly. They formed the core of my personal network, the infrastructure through which I could gather intelligence, test ideas, and implement strategies that required coordinated effort across multiple domains. The second essential element of principality building is establishing your unique value proposition, the distinctive capabilities or resources that make you indispensable to others. This might be specialized expertise, access to important networks, ability to solve particular types of problems, or skill at facilitating valuable connections. Whatever form it takes, your value proposition must be both genuine and difficult for others to replicate. I developed my value proposition around my ability to analyze complex political situations and predict likely outcomes based on understanding human nature and institutional dynamics. This capability made me valuable to Florentine leaders who needed to navigate the treacherous landscape of Italian politics, and it provided the foundation for my influence and authority. Your value proposition must evolve as circumstances change, but it should always reflect genuine capabilities rather than mere self-promotion. People will test your claims through experience, and your reputation will depend on your ability to deliver results that justify the trust and resources others invest in you. The third component involves strategic positioning within larger systems of power and influence. You cannot build a sustainable principality in isolation. You must understand how your domain relates to other centers of power, and how you can position yourself to benefit from larger trends and developments. This requires developing sophisticated understanding of the political, economic, and social forces that shape your environment. You must identify emerging opportunities before your competitors recognize them, anticipate challenges before they become crises, and position your principality to benefit from changes that might disadvantage less strategically minded actors. I learned to monitor multiple sources of information about political developments throughout Italy and beyond, looking for patterns and trends that might affect Florentine interests. This intelligence gathering allowed me to advise my superiors about strategic opportunities and threats, which enhanced my value while positioning Florence to respond effectively to changing circumstances. The fourth element involves creating systems and processes that can operate effectively whether or not you are personally present. A true principality must be more than an extension of your individual capabilities. It must be an organized system that can maintain its functions and advance its objectives through the coordinated efforts of multiple participants. This requires developing other people's capabilities, establishing clear communication channels, creating accountability mechanisms, and building institutional memory that preserves important knowledge and relationships. You must transform your personal networks into organizational assets that can survive your absence and continue serving your strategic objectives. The defense of your principality requires constant vigilance against threats from competitors, changes in the larger environment, and internal challenges from within your own organization. You must develop early warning systems that alert you to emerging problems, response capabilities that allow you to address challenges quickly, and strategic reserves that provide flexibility when circumstances require rapid adaptation. I learned that the most dangerous threats often come from unexpected directions and take forms that previous experience did not prepare you to recognize. This means that principality defense must be based on general capabilities and principles rather than specific preparations for particular threats. The expansion of your principality should be gradual, systematic, and based on consolidating previous gains before attempting new acquisitions. Each expansion should strengthen your overall position while maintaining the loyalty and effectiveness of your existing organization. Growth that outpaces your ability to maintain control and coherence will ultimately weaken rather than strengthen your position. The ultimate goal of building a personal principality is not power for its own sake, but the capability to achieve important objectives that require sustained influence and coordinated effort. Your principality should serve purposes larger than personal advancement, providing value to others while advancing your vision for how your domain should develop and contribute to larger systems of which it forms a part.
As I reach the end of this discourse on the dark laws of power, I find myself compelled to reflect on what this knowledge has meant for my life and what it might mean for yours. The burden of understanding how power truly operates is both a gift and a curse. It provides capabilities that can transform your effectiveness, but it also imposes responsibilities that will weigh on your conscience for the remainder of your days. When I first began my studies of political reality, I believed I was simply seeking practical knowledge that would make me more effective in serving Florence. I thought I was learning techniques and strategies that would help me navigate the complex world of Renaissance diplomacy and administration. What I discovered instead was a comprehensive understanding of human nature that changed not only how I approached my professional responsibilities, but how I viewed every relationship and interaction in my life. This knowledge has made me more effective, but it has also made me lonelier. Once you understand how manipulation operates, you see it everywhere. Once you recognize the strategic calculations behind apparently spontaneous gestures, you can never again experience the simple pleasure of accepting kindness at face value. Once you learn to distinguish between genuine loyalty and calculated positioning, you must always wonder which category encompasses the behavior of those around you. The price of this awareness is the loss of certain comforting illusions about human goodness and social cooperation. You cannot unknow what you have learned about the role of fear, envy, and self-interest in shaping human behavior. You cannot pretend that virtue alone will triumph over strategic cunning, or that good intentions will protect you from those who understand power's true dynamics. Yet I do not regret acquiring this knowledge, because without it I would have remained helpless against forces I could not comprehend. The world does not become less dangerous because you choose to ignore its dangers. It becomes more dangerous because you lack the awareness necessary to protect yourself and those you care about. Ignorance of power's true nature is not innocence but vulnerability. The question you must answer for yourself is how you will use this understanding. Will you apply these laws ruthlessly, seeing every interaction as an opportunity to advance your position at others' expense? Will you reject them entirely, clinging to idealistic principles that leave you defenseless against more sophisticated opponents? Or will you find some middle path that preserves your integrity while acknowledging the realities of competitive environments? I believe the wisest approach lies in understanding these laws thoroughly while applying them selectively and proportionately. There are situations where traditional virtues serve you better than strategic calculation, relationships where trust is more valuable than control, and objectives where collaboration produces better outcomes than competition. The art lies in recognizing which circumstances call for which approach. My recommendation is that you use this knowledge primarily for defensive purposes, to recognize when others are applying these laws against you and to protect yourself from manipulation, exploitation, and strategic deception. Understanding how reputation attacks work makes you less vulnerable to them. Recognizing the signs of calculated betrayal allows you to prepare appropriate responses. Knowing how attention-seeking operates helps you evaluate others' motivations more accurately. When you do apply these laws actively, do so in service of purposes larger than personal advancement. Use strategic positioning to advance important projects, not merely to enhance your own status. Apply reputation management to protect your ability to serve valuable causes, not simply to satisfy your ego. Employ calculated silence to preserve opportunities for beneficial outcomes, not just to gain advantages over others. The ultimate test of wisdom in applying these principles is whether your use of them makes the world better or worse. If your strategic behavior serves only yourself at others' expense, you are simply another predator in an already predatory world. If your understanding of power helps you protect the vulnerable, advance worthy causes, and create beneficial outcomes for multiple parties, you are using these dark laws in service of light purposes. I have tried throughout my career to apply this standard, though I confess I have not always succeeded. The temptations of power and the pressures of competitive environments sometimes led me to choices I later regretted. The isolation that comes with understanding these dynamics sometimes made me cynical when I should have remained open to genuine human connection. What I learned through experience is that the ultimate goal should not be power itself, but the capability to achieve important objectives that require influence, coordination, and strategic positioning. Power pursued for its own sake corrupts both the pursuer and the systems in which they operate. Power pursued in service of larger purposes can transform both individuals and institutions in positive ways. As you consider how to apply these dark laws in your own life, remember that they are tools, not values. They are means, not ends. They are capabilities, not purposes. The meaning of your life will be determined not by how skillfully you apply these techniques, but by what you use them to accomplish and how your actions affect the lives of others. The true measure of wisdom is knowing when to use power and when to refrain from using it, when to compete and when to collaborate, when to be strategic and when to be spontaneous. These dark laws will give you options you did not previously possess, but the choices you make among those options will determine whether you become a force for good or simply another practitioner of effective selfishness. Choose wisely, act proportionately, and never lose sight of the purposes that originally motivated your desire for influence and capability. The world needs people who understand power's true nature and choose to use that understanding in service of humanity's better angels rather than its darker impulses.